Hi, and welcome back to Mr. Raymond's AP Government and Politics series, where today we are going to start our last unit of AP Gov with a review of topics 5.1 and 5.2, political participation, voting rights, and quote-unquote models of voting. So, let's start with the basics of political participation. How does the average citizen participate in the political process in the United States? They vote. We might see terms in this unit like suffrage or occasionally franchise to describe the ability and the power to vote. You tell them, Taylor. To participate in the political process in this country, you aren't limited to voting. You can donate to a candidate or volunteer, petition or protest the government for political change. So let's crank through topic 5.1, voting amendments and laws, and what College Board calls the models of voting. So we always want to have the Constitution in the back of our mind, especially when we write our FRQs, and we mentioned how the Constitution has some pretty vague language in it. But nowhere does it directly address the right to vote. Or, more specifically, who has the right to vote. In Article 1 of the Constitution, it states that the House of Representatives would be, quote-unquote, chosen every second year by the people. The Constitution also says that the, quote-unquote, times, places, and manner of holding elections shall be prescribed in each state, thus again making elections a reserved power. But the bigger point is, the framers of the Constitution knew we'd be having elections, but they left it up to the states to determine who could vote. It would take a long time and the passing of multiple amendments and legislation to decide who made up the electorate. And the trend has been the expansion of that electorate since the beginning of our union. Now, around the time of Jacksonian democracy or Andrew Jackson's presidency in the late 1820s, most states got rid of property requirements to vote, and this greatly expanded the franchise to most white men. And that was how things stayed until the Civil War and the passage of the 15th Amendment, allowing black men the right to vote. However, you already know how states afterwards would enact voting regulations to disenfranchise black men through grandfather clauses, literacy tests, poll taxes, etc. The 17th Amendment didn't expand the electorate, but did make our votes more important, as we would now be voting for our state senators, which, as you know, is a very powerful elected position. The 19th Amendment, one I hope you know, finally gave women the right to vote in 1920, crazy late. The 24th Amendment, passed in the 1960s, abolished poll taxes, or having to pay a fee or tax to vote, one of the last vestiges of Jim Crow voting prohibitionist practices. Poll taxes also did disenfranchise many poor whites. Finally, the 26th Amendment lowered the voting age from 21 to 18. It was passed during the Vietnam War, in which young American men were being drafted to fight in a war by Congress and the president whom they didn't vote for. So we've talked quite a bit about the Civil Rights Act of 1964, but not so much with the Voting Rights Act of 1965. This law not only got rid of the structural barrier of literacy tests to vote, but it also gave the federal government oversight into state elections, targeting those with a history of voter discrimination. Parts of that clause were found unconstitutional in 2013, and others are currently being challenged by some state legislatures, so we'll have to see what happens with that. Okay, so let's get to what College Board calls models of voting behavior. Political scientists often just refer to these as theories, and I'm going to start out by saying I'm not a huge fan of these models. Sorry, AP Central, I said it. But let's get through them anyway. They are rational choice, retrospective voting, prospective voting, and party line voting. Okay, so since these models are added to the curriculum, every textbook and study book I can find has a definition for rational choice theory as, quote-unquote, voting in their best interest. Now, I thought that would have been a given when you're going to vote, but examples of rational choice might be voting based on which candidate is going to do what's best for you, maybe economically or socially. For the retrospective model, an individual votes based on whether a candidate or a party in power should be reelected based on their recent past policies, job performance, things like that. Now, it's not always an incumbent, but in the scenario AP will give you, the word incumbent might be a clue that it's retrospective, because they have to have some sort of track record on policies that they pass, whatever past performance they have politically, that's making an individual vote for them right now. Now, they might give you a scenario like this guy who is an independent but is voting Republican in the next election because they recently cut his taxes. That would be retrospective. The prospective model is the reverse of that. A person votes based on a candidate or a party that they think will best serve their needs in the future. So you're looking for that word future. Finally, and what is the norm for around 2/3 of Americans, we have the party line model. Under this model, you just fill out what's called a straight ticket, a ballot, and just check off every Democrat or Republican on the ballot. And we'll talk in a minute about why this is becoming more common. So when I teach the models of voting behavior, some students will always ask me if people fit into different models. And the answer is definitely yes. For instance, you can make the argument that you joined a party and are voting party line because you used retrospective reasoning to make your choice. Anyway, that's kind of why I'm not a big fan of these. But just remember, they'll probably give you some scenario of a hypothetical voter. If they're talking about the past, aka retro, it's retrospective. Future, prospects, prospective. Party line is pretty obvious, and if it's straight, quote unquote, what's in their best interest, go with rational thought. Okay, so our next topic is voter turnout, and our benchmark is highlighting terms we're going to need to know: efficacy, structural barriers, and demographics, as well as state laws and how they can impact voter turnout. In 2012, 62% of the U.S. electorate, and when we say electorate, we mean all eligible voters, only 62% turned out for the presidential election. It turns out, though, that was the highest turnout since the 1960s. 2 years later, only 36% showed up for a midterm election. Now, there are two benchmarks covered in that scenario. One is that you need to know presidential elections, as you might have suspected, have a much higher turnout due to the national attention they receive than midterm elections do. But those midterm elections will have your representative in the House of Reps in Congress running, possibly your U.S. Senator, your state representatives, your local representatives. And they are being decided by a tiny percentage of the population. So why does the U.S. have such a low rate of voting? First off, there are a lot of Americans that feel that their vote doesn't have efficacy, there's that word, or value. A lot of Americans have lost trust in the government and feel frustrated with most politicians, so they have lost political efficacy or the belief that change is possible and begins with the individual. A lot of Americans also suffer from voter apathy or just a plain lack of interest. And we've seen this trend since the late 1800s, when 80% of the electorate would vote, to our downward slide to hitting around 60%. But the trends are moving a little higher, so maybe we will see a return to more interest in our elections. As we mentioned before, elections are a reserved power. Their state legislatures have the power to prescribe, as the Constitution says, times, places, and manners of all elections, whether the position is for national, state, or local elections. But what follows that sentence is that Congress has power to, quote-unquote, regulate or alter state election policies. But it is those differences in state voting practices and laws that impact voter turnout. Okay, so let's look at structural barriers to vote. Examples include registration rules. In some states, felons can't vote. We've been talking about the push for stronger ID requirements, all of which can be structural barriers to some of our most disadvantaged. So because registration requirements differ from state to state, one of the outcomes is that states with shorter registration cutoffs have a higher voter percentage. In some states, you have to register 30 days before an election. Others allow you to register on election day, and those states have a much higher turnout. Another reason some Americans don't vote is what's known as ballot fatigue. With so many elections and so many public officials, and now state referendums and local referendums, some feel, and most likely do, lack the time to stay informed on all the issues. Is that a structural barrier? Okay, so here's a legit one. Why is Election Day on a Tuesday? Most people have to work on Tuesdays. Well, most states allow for early voting, and we'll see what happens with mail-in ballots. I think they're here to stay, but in some states, Election Day is still on Tuesday, and some of us just can't make it out of work. Actually, I can, but whatever. So, like early voting, there are other ways that some state governments are trying to increase participation. One way that the federal government responded was passing what's called the Motor Voter Act, which allows you to register to vote when you get your driver's license. Finally, a couple of slides here on demographics. Well, my young people listening, you aren't great at voting. We get it, a lot of you are at college and getting used to life, but it's important that you vote. Okay, boomer? And what demographics are the most likely to vote? Well, the elderly, the educated, and the wealthy. If you look right here, here's a chart with the voting rate based how high an educational degree you have. Anyway, voting is one of our most fundamental rights. Some Americans have shed blood, sweat, and tears over their quest to gain this right. Be sure to take advantage. And I'll see you back here soon as we finish politics and the course. But before we do, let's review. What word do we use to describe all the eligible voters? The electorate. Are elections enumerated powers or reserved? You should know the answer to that. Reserved powers. What does reserved mean? Simply means that it's the states that are in charge. This amendment gave women the right to vote. The 19th. What are some of the many reasons that Americans don't vote? Well, they fail to register. There's too many elections. Apathy. Lack of efficacy. This law was meant to make it easier to register to vote. The Motor Voter Act. And that's it. I want to thank you guys for watching. Be sure to subscribe, and I'll see you soon. Teachers, click the link down below this.